Top of the morning to you. My name is Martha Shanahan, and I am going to be your guide this afternoon through the beautiful Emerald Isle of Ireland. When I think of Ireland, one of the first things that I picture are those rolling green hills filled with the lush vegetation. And a lot of that comes from the fact that as clouds are accumulating precipitation as they come across the Atlantic, when they reach that land sea barrier or threshold, it often releases the clouds and they pour the rain across the small country of Ireland. And with the amount of rain that they get, that is what allows things to grow and be so vibrant and green in the country of Ireland. I also think of those beautiful castles that dot the country. Ireland, although how small it is, has about 30,000 castles in the country. And of course, you can't think of the country of Ireland without thinking of their pub culture, where every street has a corner bar where you can go in and get a pint of Guinness. A mischievous little leprechaun hiding his pot of gold at the end of a rainbow. And I can't think of Irish culture without thinking of Michael Flatley's Lord of the Dance. Remember Riverdance? Now that was quite the sensation. Those are just a few things that I think of when I think of the country of Ireland. I wanted to delve a little bit deeper into the history and culture of the great country of Ireland. So going back a little bit further, between 7,000 and 6,000 BC is when the first inhabitants enter Ireland, or at least when we have the first evidence of it. And that was right around the end of the last ice age. They believe because the sea level was a lot lower from the glaciers, taking up a lot of the liquid in the ocean, as well as ice sheets taking the form of land, that there was a land bridge that allowed the first humans to cross over into Ireland from Britain. And there was a very small section of the country, as you can see on the map in green, that was not widely glaciated at the time. And they believe that that was the first settlements of the people. And as the glaciers receded, people started to settle throughout the country and eventually was cut off from the mainland of Britain. The first Irish people lived by a hunting and gathering type of lifestyle. They gathered foods such as plants and shellfish. They tended to settle on the seashore, banks of rivers and lakes where food was plentiful. They hunted animals like deer and wild boar, birds, and even seals with harpoons. At about 4000 BC, farming was introduced to the country of Ireland, and that was during the Stone Age. Farmers kept livestock such as sheep, pigs, and cattle. They began to raise some crops and do some gardening and agricultural lifestyle. They probably lived in huts with wooden frames that was covered by thatched roofs. They started to make tools out of stone, bone, and antlers. They also made pottery, which we have several pieces of evidence from. And for centuries, the farmers and the hunters sort of coexisted, but eventually it sort of moved away from the hunter-gatherer lifestyle as that died out and really moved into a more agricultural country, as a lot of it still is today. One of the most stunning pieces of history that we have in Ireland today comes to us from around 3000 BC. There are a number of them around the country that they call a megalithic tomb. And there are several examples of it, but of course the most famous one being what we have called Newgrange. It has been since deemed a World Heritage Site by UNESCO, and it is probably the finest example we have of these sort of passage tombs that were built by Ireland's ancient inhabitants. It is older than both Stonehenge and the Egyptian pyramids. And this Newgrange happens to be the biggest one that we still have intact today. And it is 250 feet across and 40 feet high. What we originally thought as was just a passage tomb, after some archaeological findings, it has actually been deemed that it was probably much more essential and important than just a tomb, that it even functioned as an ancient temple would have been more of a fitting term for it, as it seems that it had a lot of spiritual, religious, and ceremonial importance. Much as a present-day cathedrals would have been prestigious places of worship, as well as where dignitaries may have been laid to rest. And that is what we think is probably a more fitting idea of what these passage tombs were to these people at that time. Here you can see the entrance of Newgrange, and you see these large rocks that are sort of surrounding that front entrance, and they go all the way around. There, it is surrounded by 97 large stones that they call curbstones. Not all of them, but some of them are engraved with beautiful artwork. Really, the most striking one is the one that we see here right in front of the entrance doorway. And please take note of the little opening that's right above that entrance doorway. We're going to talk a little bit about the purpose of that in the next slide. So on the winter solstice with the rising sun, right as it's rising, that beam of sun comes into that little opening that we looked at right above the doorway in the previous slide, and it strikes a beam of light that goes down a narrow passageway 62 feet into the center of the tomb, where there's a chamber and there's 3 alcoves in it, and it lights up what is normally would have been a pitch dark interior of this. And so that is a lot of why we believe that it has some sort of astronomical affiliation and spiritual and religious matters as well. So besides being used for burial, it would have been used for these religious purposes, probably having to do with the sun or their sun god or deity in some manner or form. A lot of times when we hear about the Irish culture, we think of the word Celtic or Celtic, and so that really stems from the Celts' arrival in Europe. They had a lot of similarities to the Vikings, but we're going to talk a little bit about their differences. And the Celts really came prior to the Vikings, and they were a people that arose in Central Europe very quickly around 1000 BC. And as you can see from the map here, that pinkish color, that was sort of their kingdom. So as you can see, they were very prevalent. And around 500 BC is when they arrived in Ireland. And what made them very powerful at that time was the fact that they had iron weapons and they were pretty good at warfare. And what's a little bit different though, because they did have sort of this warlike reputation and they did love battle, but they were not, from my understanding, as vicious, maybe is I'm not sure if it's the right word, as the Vikings were, and we'll talk about them a little bit later in the slideshow. But early records show that the Celts were excellent shipbuilders and sailors, and they developed several hundred ships that were involved in great distances for exploration. And although the Celtic people did really enjoy a good battle, but they also had a lot more to their culture as well. They were bound together by traditions and customs. They were very agricultural. They also had a class system. They had a king who headed up a tribe and then was divided by class into what they called druids, which were their religious people, or what we would call maybe a priest or some sort of religious leader. They had warrior nobles, and then they had commoners. Nobles would fight on foot with swords and spears, and as a culture, they really enjoyed feasting and drinking and sort of that party, fun, light atmosphere as well, of course, after a good brawl. In Celtic mythology, It included a lot of, they were polytheistic, so they had many different gods, including earth gods, various woodland spirits, and sun deities. Was particularly the teaching of the ancestors of the Celts. And we still see remnants of that culture today in Ireland and England. A lot like when we think of like the leprechaun, that would have been something that had stemmed from this Celtic sort of woodland fairies and creatures and things along those lines. Okay, I'm going to make one attempt to use this Irish term, fulach fiad. Please forgive me, I have no idea if that is correct, but from now on I'm going to call them burnt mounds by their other name. And so these in Ireland alone, there is about 6,000 of these such archaeological sites that have been recorded. And they're not exactly sure, what they were used for, but there's a lot of different theories. What we do know is that they came about, most of them were formed in the Bronze Age. And it was basically, there was like a rectangle hole in the ground, and it would have been lined with either slabs of stone, more likely, or wood, and then filled with water. There was also a hearth nearby, and usually a pile of stones in a horseshoe shape that would have been burnt and cracked by the heat. And they were commonly found near a source of water. Now, what they believe, the most commonly accepted theory, is that they were used for cooking during the Bronze Age. And so what they would do is they would fill this rectangle hole with water, and then they would with the fire, they would heat up the stones, and then they would take these really extremely hot, mostly limestone, but sometimes other ones, put it in the water to create a boiling water system where they could cook meat such as venison. That is the most commonly accepted theory, but there are a few other ones. Although the cooking is the most common theory, and I like to kind of refer to it as the very first original sous vide, if anyone ever uses that to cook, which is really a very healthy way of cooking food at low temperatures for a long time in hot-ish water. But some other theories included, and some people are rejecting that theory because what they're saying is if they had used it to cook deer or other forms of livestock at that time, we would have found some evidence of that at those sites, like hooves that wouldn't have burnt up, and there haven't been anything found like that. So the other theories that come into play are perhaps it was used for bathing, washing or dyeing cloth, brewing beer, some of those other ones. And then another one is some of these sites have been found with evidence that there was some sort of temporary housing or hut nearby. So another theory also is that they used it, the heat, as enclosing it in a steam manner, because there was some Gaelic sweat houses, which were built of stone, that were very popular amongst that culture. And so they think it may have mimicked that. But again, we're not entirely sure. Those are just some theories that they came up with. So I was wondering if the Celtic Empire was so huge as we saw in the previous map. I was sort of curious as to why we sort of associate that with that Irish culture a lot of times. And so really what it came down to was the Celtic decline with the rise of the Roman Empire. And so Julius Caesar in the first century BC really launched a military campaign against the Celtic people, killing them by the thousands and destroying their culture in much of mainland Europe. But because Great Britain and Ireland and Scotland were sort of a little bit removed from the mainland Europe, the Romans were like, meh, really not that concerned with it. The the Roman Empire did end up taking over Britain, but they really didn't care too much about Ireland and Scotland. And so that is why a lot of the culture of the Celts still remains there, and we see it more prevalently than in the rest of Europe. And of course, I'm sure that you've heard about the term Irish Catholic. So, which, if you were listening to the Celtic religious affiliations, very differently seeming than the Catholic Irish that we have come to know today. So, how did Christianity and Catholicism really come to be so prevalent in Ireland? Stems from who we commonly know as St. Patrick. Um, and that was from around 432. And Patrick was a young man who was actually born in England. Sometimes you will hear that he was Italian, and that comes from the fact that the Roman Empire had overtaken and was ruling Britain at the time, but he was probably born in what we presently know as England. And he was captured by the Irish raiders at the age of 16. He was taken to Ireland as a slave, and I believe until he was, I believe, 22, in his early 20s, he was able to escape. But during his time of enslavement, he actually found his way to a Bible, and he attributes that that is sort of what got through that hard time. When he escaped, he went back to England, and he actually went on to become a missionary for the Catholic Church. And he wanted to and did fulfill that desire to go back to Ireland and really live out the rest of his life until his death as a missionary. And his mission was to bring Christianity to all of Ireland. From around 500 to 800, they really call that the golden age of the Irish Catholic Church. Many monasteries were founded across the country. It was also the dark ages for most of the world, where a lot of people lost literacy, couldn't read, couldn't write, but the Irish monks are actually attributed with keeping the written language alive through that time, as they were one of the only people that could still read and write and transcribe the written word as well. And also during that time, the Catholic Church had deemed it sacrilegious to make artwork. But these monks sort of found a little bit a way around it. And when they were doing their transcribing, what they started to do was get very elaborate with the first letter of the page. And as you can see in this picture, it sort of went on from there, but it was their way of sort of expressing that artwork in a time where it was really not allowed, but this was their loophole of sort of getting around it. And so we call the books from this time illuminated manuscripts, and most of them that we have, or even the best examples that we have of them, really come from Ireland during this time. However, this golden age was ended with the raid of Vikings. So as I mentioned before, the Celtic people and the Vikings also share some similarities, as the Vikings were also a very warfaring people. They were also great shipbuilders. In fact, they were even better shipbuilders than the Celtic people. I would say the main difference is that the Celtic people really arose from Central Europe, whereas the Vikings really stemmed from the Scandinavian part of the world, Sweden, Norway, and Denmark. And they used their shipbuilding abilities to sail over and really attack in Ireland and in England. And they looted monasteries, they took women and children as slaves. As I said, they were a little bit more harsh and brutal than the Celtic people were. But warfare and battle wasn't the only things that the Vikings brought with them. They were also traders and craftsmen. They had a very sophisticated culture, which included advanced shipbuilding, a lot of technology, and even things like poetry, metalworking, and agriculture. They were also attributed at founding Ireland's first towns of Dublin, Wexford, Cork, and Limerick. They also gave Ireland its name, which is actually a combination of a Gaelic word, Erie, which is what the country was called prior to their arrival, and what some natives still call it today, and the Viking word land. So Erie Land, Ireland, is what we know it as today. Eventually, they sort of settled down a bit. They intermarried with the Irish people. They accepted Christianity, and they sort of assimilated into the Irish culture, really melding into one. After the Vikings had settled in and started to accept the Irish culture and assimilate with their religious services as well. But one thing about the Irish church, although it was Catholic, you did still see some remnants that they had kind of included still from their Celtic culture prior. Pope Adrian IV didn't really like that, and so he really wanted to reform the Irish church to really be a little bit more Roman Catholic. And so in 1155 AD, he gave the English king, Henry II, permission to invade Ireland so that he could sort out the church. By the early 13th century, the English had extended their control over all of Ireland. In the Middle Ages, the English landowners that were now in Ireland after the raid had really absorbed into the Irish society. Many of them started to intermarry. They were slowly adopting Irish customs, which really wasn't the goal that nor the Pope nor the King really had in mind when they wanted to settle the land with English loyals. And so they had set up a British Parliament, but in Kilkenny. And so what they did in 1366 was passed what they call the Statutes of Kilkenny. And it really prevented any Anglo-Irish. They were forbidden to marry native Irish people. They were also forbidden to speak Gaelic or play an Irish game of hurling. They were not allowed to wear Irish dress or ride bareback. They must use a saddle. However, all of these attempts that they did put into law to separate these races, it really failed. It didn't go like how they had planned. The people, because they were living in it, just tended to sort of evolve in that manner and integrate. So what was happening in the political and religious arenas in the 16th century Europe? The Reformation. And so what does that mean for Ireland? Because now it was the Roman Catholic Church that gave permission to England to invade and take over Ireland to reform the church. But now England is rebelling against the Italian Catholic Church. And so Ireland, which is now ruled by England, but really has ties to the Catholic Church and their culture, kind of left them in the middle of this struggle. So because of what was going on religiously between England and Italy and the Catholic Church, it really left a lot of tension between the Irish Catholic people and the English who were controlling the country at that time. So in the 16th century, several English monarchs attempted to maintain control of Ireland. Henry VII through diplomatic strategies, to Edward and Elizabeth more militantly. Land was confiscated from Irish and given to English settlers in an attempt to have more English loyal citizens in the country. But of course, that really backfired because it raised a lot of tension and resentment for the native Irish people. Of course, those tensions led to violence, and there were several rebellions throughout the country. One really major rebellion in Ulster's following that, the leaders of that were really fearing for their lives, and so they ended up fleeing to France, and all of the land that was theirs was confiscated by King James. So between 1610 and 1613, what they did was with that confiscated land, they gave it to English people to settle, again in sort of that attempt to have more English loyals settling in the country to sort of hopefully stabilize that. And for the first time, there were more Protestant settlers than native Irish ones in Northern Ireland at that time. However, the native Irish were again very resentful of what happened, and in 1641, Ulster rose in rebellion and massacres of Protestant people occurred. At the time, the Irish wool trade was very successful and lucrative because of labor costs being lower in Ireland than they were in England, and a lot of Irish wool was being exported to many other countries. English merchants decided that they didn't like that competition, so in 1699, the Irish were forbidden to export wool to any country except for England, but England already charged them very high import duties, and there was little demand for it there because they had their own. And so exports of Irish wool were effectively ended by the English at that time, which was really crippling to a lot of the economy in Ireland, and again, leading to further tension that relationship. In 1704, several acts were put into place restricting Catholics from many things, and this was further efforts from England to really oppress and control the Irish Catholic people and the country. It forbid Catholics from holding any positions of power in office, as well as forbidding them from buying land, inheriting land, or leaving land to an heir. It has also barred them from education, voting, and military. Because of this, along with things like the barring of wool export, there was a great deal of dire poverty in Ireland during the 18th century, and its worst really came to a head with a famine in 1741. This disaster killed hundreds of thousands of people, and in the 1760s, a lot of these grievances that had piled up among the Irish peasants really boiled over into violence. So, what was happening in our country in 1775? That's right, the American Revolution. And so, how did that impact Ireland? So, with the loss of the American colonies, England started to sort of fear that loss a little bit. And so they really wanted to try and make measures in Ireland a little bit better in fear of losing them as well. So in 1778, the laws restricting the rights of Catholics were gradually repealed. They regained the right to buy land, to practice law, to marry Protestants, and to vote, although they did not re-implement their ability to sit for Parliament or to run for office. Britain also began to industrialize Northern Ireland, and the population of Ireland rapidly increased from less than 2 million in 1700 to nearly 5 million in 1800. By the end of the 18th century, the ideas of the American Revolution had reached the Irish people, and in 1791, the Society of United Irishmen was founded. The society came together and they really wanted Ireland to become an independent republic with religious toleration for all. Does anyone know what came next in 1845? The Great Potato Famine. In 1845, potato blight hit Ireland. And in that time, a large part of the Irish population lived on potatoes and buttermilk, which is not the most nutritious diet, but it did sustain them in life. The British government did very little to help the Irish people who were literally starving to death during this time. The English government was very hesitant to give away free food. They did try and implement some work programs to help them get money, but the people were in a weakened condition. They were starving to death, and that led them to weakened immune systems with little resistance to disease. Hundreds of thousands of people died each year of starvation and then diseases on top of that in their condition. Due to the condition of the people in the country, many native Irish fled abroad. And in 1851 alone, some 250,000 people emigrated from Ireland, although many of them did die on board the ship of disease. The population of Ireland fell dramatically from over 8 million in 1841 to about 6.5 million in 1851, and it continued to fall. Even today, the population has not been able to recover from that, as it still lingers below about 7 million people today. An estimated 1 million people died during the famine. Many others emigrated, and the failure of the British government to deal with the famine caused a lasting bitterness with the Irish people.
Civil War.
In the 1900s, Ireland moved towards civil war. Those efforts were put on hold during the duration of the First World War. And in December of 1918, Ireland formed their own parliament. In January of 1919, guerrilla warfare started and continued into civil war until May of 1923.
Independence.
There were 6 northeastern countries that were large groups were descendants from British settlers, and they did not want independence. They really wanted to remain loyal to England. These unionists threatened to fight against their efforts for independence. But at the end of the War of Independence, the Irish and the British leaders agreed to a treaty. 26 of the 32 counties in Ireland became independent. However, 6 of the 9 counties of Ulster remain part of the UK. And that is where we get the Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland separation that we still see today. In 1937, a new constitution made and elected a president head of state. And in 1948, Ireland was made a republic and the last ties with Britain were cut, and Northern Ireland was declared a separate entity.
Modern-day Ireland.
Modern-day culture in Ireland includes rural and urban populations, Catholic and Protestant, Gaelic and English speakers. Its heart is Celtic, with many festivals based on ancient pagan ceremonies that have survived through countries' often tense religious history of Catholic conversion and Protestant influence. This country takes their hard-won religious freedom very seriously. Legends, folktales, and beliefs in supernatural beings such as leprechauns are commonplace, and the lucky 3-leafed shamrock is a much-loved symbol. Irish dance, gypsy music, and great literature are all part of Ireland's rich and colorful cultural heritage.
Irish step dancing.
The roots of Irish dancing come from the Celts and the Druids who roamed the island before the onset of Christianity and outside influences came along. Many of the Druids' religious rituals involve dancing, usually in a circular fashion around sacred trees. The Viking raids during the 10th century destroyed most of the books in existence. However, it is certain that music and dance played an important role in the Gaelic culture. Many of the designs on the current day costumes are based on the illustrated manuscripts of the Bible that those Irish monks produced during the Dark Ages.
The Blarney Stone.
This age-old tradition began in the 18th century of kissing the Blarney Stone. According to legend, kissing the stone endows the kisser with the gift of gab, meaning clever, flattering, or coaxing talk. Leprechauns are something that we know as very prevalent in Ireland today, but they are, as I mentioned before, left over from the ancient Celtic tradition when pixies and nymphs and fairies were part of their religious practices. Leprechauns were thought to be these small people that would dress all in green and they would hide a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. They had a reputation for being tricksters and having a prankster sense of humor. And the theory goes that if you are able to find the pot of gold and are able to trick the leprechaun, you're able to keep the gold. But as legend has it, the leprechauns are extremely smart and they are often the ones that end up tricking the human. And so it's very, very rare that anyone would ever get to keep that pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, even if they did locate it. A fun fact about Ireland is the Titanic was actually built in Northern Ireland. When the Titanic was designed, there were no facilities that existed to be able to hold a ship of that capacity to actually build it. And Harland and Wolff was a shipyard in Belfast, Ireland, and they actually set out to be able to be that shipyard to be big enough to build it. So they demolished 3 smaller slipways to build 2 really large ones in order to be able to be the shipyard to build the Titanic. As I mentioned earlier in the presentation, Ireland has 30,000 castles, which is such a large amount for such a small country. And some people wonder, why does it have such a vast amount of castles in it? But as you've now seen with Ireland's history, it has, been taken over with a lot of violence and wars and turmoil. And so because of that, a lot of families built castles to protect their loved ones. They were a lot of fortresses. A lot of them may have been previous monasteries. So that is a big reason, because of their history, as to why there are so many castles in the country of Ireland. If anyone has ever been to Ireland or even to an Irish pub here in the Boston area, you know that Guinness is the main drink of the Irish people. It is a dark, dry stout that originated in the brewery on St. James Street in Dublin, Ireland in 1759, and it is one of the most successful beer brands worldwide. Arthur Guinness was the gentleman who started the brewery when he inherited £100 from his godfather, who was an archbishop, and he decided to use those funds to set up a brewery. In 1759, he moved the operation to Dublin, but the brewing industry was actually floundering. It wasn't doing very good, but he had faith that he would be successful and was determined. And he actually signed a 9,000-year lease on the brewery building on St. James Street in Dublin, where beer is still brewed today. And of course, this investment has paid off. Another fun fact that I discovered about Ireland was the national emblem of Ireland is actually not the shamrock like I would have thought, but it is actually the harp, which is also the logo for Guinness. So I was a little curious as to where that came from, and after a little bit of research, my understanding is that ever since the medieval times, the Irish harpists were famous throughout Europe for how their music and their skilled playing of harps. And they used to travel around writing music for patrons, and also were often hired for very important events all throughout Europe. One breathtaking tourist attraction in Ireland is on the west coast, called the Cliffs of Moher. And as you can see here, it stretches for a number of kilometers in these dramatic drop-offs from the shore at an almost 90-degree angle down to the raging Atlantic Ocean. These dramatic cliffs run for about 9 miles. At their southern end, they rise 120 meters, about 390 feet above the Atlantic Ocean. And about 5 miles to the north, they reach their maximum height of 702 feet. Hag's Head is a rock formation along the cliffs of Moher that is said to look like an old lady's face. Irish legend tells us the story of an old hag who fell madly in love with a great Irish hero, but he did not return her feelings and ran all over Ireland trying to escape her advances. He was running away from her and decided that he would be jumping on the sea stacks out by the cliffs of Moher. And when she tried to follow him, she was not as agile, missed her footing, and was dashed to pieces against the cliff. And she is forever captured in this rock formation. This is just a wonderful example of some of those sea stacks that you'll see out by the cliffs of Moher. And the theory is that they used to be attached to the cliffs, but because of the waves and erosion, they've actually been separated apart from them, and they now appear as these kind of rock stacks in the middle of the sea. Another stunning example we have of nature's beauty is in Northern Ireland called the Giant's Causeway. The Giant's Causeway is an area of about 40,000 interlocking basalt columns, which was a result of an ancient volcanic fissure eruption. And that brings us to the end of our historical tour of the beautiful country of Ireland. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did.